I'm Emily Carlin. I am moderating this session. I would like to remind everyone that if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A, and you can use the chat just for chatting with one another during the presentation. But if you have any questions, just put them into the Q&A, and I will relay them to our presenter. Our presenter today is Michelle Eichelberger from SUNY Library Shared Services. Michelle is the Discovery and E-Resources Program Manager for SLSS. In the past 20 years, she's served as the Systems Librarian at FLCC and GCC. She managed recent library web accessibility remediation at Genesee Community College and has hands-on experience with the importance of making online content accessible for all users. Thank you, Michelle.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on web accessibility in SUNY libraries. Let me just get going here. So our plan for today is we're going to take a look at the SUNY EIT policy and how it applies to libraries. We're going to talk about the library accessibility guidelines. That's not going to be the main focus of today's talk, but I did want to just do a quick review of those guidelines. We're going to look at the SLSS accessibility guide content and a service that we have offered. And then we're going to take a brief deep dive into web accessibility tips and tricks. So first we're going to talk about the SUNY EIT policies. There have been a series of webinars about these policies a couple weeks ago, and those recordings are up on the SUNY Blue site. One of the things I wanted to note that it's actually kind of difficult to find these policies and the recordings. If you Google it, it doesn't come up in a search. So I did include the link here in this presentation, and these slides will be posted after the recordings and everything are done. So that is here, and I will talk about a couple other ways to find it as we go forward in the presentation. So this is a little screenshot of the site. What does it include? It has links to the policies themselves. There are 5 categories that the EIT group decided on for different areas of accessibility. And the thing to remember is that even though there is a specific category for libraries, it doesn't mean that any of the other policies don't apply to libraries as well. So you do need to keep in mind that web, digital content, procurement, and classroom can also all apply to your library. And as I mentioned, there are recordings of the webinars that were presented for each of the areas. This site also includes a list of the campus EIT officers, and that's really helpful because those people can connect you with DeCue University enrollment. And DeCue University is a place where you can take online courses and get certificates for training in accessibility, not just for the web, but all kinds of things. And they're really well laid out and really great classes, so I would highly encourage you to take advantage of those. And then this also has information about the SUNY Web Accessibility Listserv, contact information, all of those kinds of things. So now we're going to talk about the library-specific accessibility guidelines. This isn't just for web, but I did want you to be aware that this material is out there if you weren't already aware of that. This is a direct link to the guidance that was put together by a committee. And as I mentioned, all of the other standards do apply to libraries as well, not just these standards. And so the recommendations are for library services and digital content. And this is a direct link to the webinar where we went through all the different pieces of it, but I'm going to just give a brief overview as well. So library services, these are the kinds of things that you want to be aware of. The SUNY EIT draft plan is due on June 30th, and this is really what it's a good idea to base your section on. There is a section just for libraries, so I think what the EIT committee is hoping to receive from you all is, addressing each of these standards. What are you going to do to establish policies and procedures? Where are you in that process? Who's going to be in charge of that? Do you need extra funding to make that happen, etc.? So these are the kinds of things, designate a liaison for specifically EIT related support, and then put that person's name on your website, make it easy for people to find that information and contact that person, provide training, make sure that you have assistive technologies and equipment, etc. I'm not going to go through each of these in depth. And then digitizing content is the second section of the library accessibility guidelines, and so these are some things that people in the library might care about other than more than other areas, just in terms of ILL. You know, if you're doing scans for people, make sure that they are able to be OCR'd so that it can be read by a screen reader. You know, when you're doing collection development, make sure that you buy things that, you know, if you're buying a video, make sure that it's captioned. So these, you know, include transcripts for any recordings. If you've done a webinar or some kind of training on how to use the library, make sure that that's captioned. So these are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind, and these are the kinds of things you want to address in your accessibility plan. So why should you care about this stuff? As I mentioned, the campus accessibility plan is due June 30th. It is a first draft. It doesn't have to be perfect. And my guess is that you're probably working with a committee on your campus to pull this information together, because the plan is not just the library, it's all of those 5 groups that I mentioned. You should care about this because online accessibility is always important, but COVID-19 makes it even more important than ever, as many of your libraries are still closed and people are getting access to your content virtually online. COVID-19 also means tighter budgets, and there is going to be more attention paid to whether or not the content that you're purchasing is accessible. Those kinds of requirements are going to be in the procurement section, and if you were just in Juan Denzer's session on looking at vendors' accessibility, you will have seen that SLSS is, we're starting a cohort to look at that, and also we've started a third-party repository, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, with that's gathering VPATs for vendors, those kinds of things. So making your physical and virtual spaces is the right thing to do. It's really a social justice issue. You want to make sure that your content is available to everybody. So I mentioned that the SUNY and I did this wrong. Should be SUNY Library Shared Services. My apology. I've been in this position for a year and I am still messing that up sometimes. So anyway, we can help you with this. We do have an accessibility LibGuide, and that is, the link to that is right here. And in this guide, what we have are best practices for web design, which we're going to go into in a little bit more depth in this presentation, a little bit of information about Zoom. We do have a shared service, which I'll talk about in a minute. This training page, this has information about the Q training and how to get registered to take those classes online. Here's a link to the SUNY EIT standards. I had said that those are sometimes hard to find when you just do a Google search, so I do have them all linked here under the SUNY EIT standards. And then this third-party repository, which I mentioned, this is a work in progress. We've just started this, and basically what it is now is a tabbed box with the vendors that are most commonly used across SUNY. It certainly doesn't have all of them. We tried to start with things that were either purchased centrally, like EBSCO, or that we get through Novel, things like Gale, or things that we might be considering purchasing centrally that we're looking at. So I would say right now there's probably between 20 to 30 vendors right now in the repository, and Bill Jones did a great job. He went out and found links from vendors' websites. Also, if they did have a VPAT online, he's linked to that. And if they didn't have it, he linked to the CUNY site, which does have a list of VPATs. So that's a good place to go look for that kind of information. I mentioned that the campus accessibility plan is due on June 30th, and we do have an FAQ of where to start if you're, you know, kind of looking at it and thinking, oh man, how do I even get started with that? This has kind of a layout of what our recommendations would be. We also have a link to our SUNY piece of it, just if you wanted to see what we did with it. So that is out there as well. And I'm just going to take a quick breath here. Are there any questions so far? I do see that there's something in the Q&A.
Yeah, someone wanted to know if you could give the accessibility online learning website again.
I'm not quite sure what you mean. You mean the DQ website? If you are asking about DQ, that is here under the training tab, and you can start at this particular site right here. And once we're done with this main presentation, if you have questions, once I stop sharing, I'd be happy to paste these links into the chat.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. So I had mentioned that SUNY does have a web review service, and Shannon mentioned this in one of our monthly updates, and we didn't get any takers, which I was kind of surprised about, but maybe it's because people already have software at their campuses to review their websites, things like Cite and Prove. We do have a license for SortSite. And what's cool about it is that we can do as many websites as we want. It goes through and gives you a report of all the problems that it found. So if you are interested in having us run your website or your LibGuide site or whatever through this and have us send you a report, we are happy to do that. If we got tons of requests, it might take us a little while to get that information back to you, but that is a service that we're offering. You don't have to have any special contract with us to make that happen. We're definitely interested in improving accessibility across SUNY libraries, so however we can help you with that, we are happy to do that. As I mentioned, SortSite, it's similar to Cite and Prove. It checks for errors, outdated code, accessibility problems, etc. Okay, hang on, I'm going to take another quick break here. Any other questions before I start diving deeper into web accessibility itself?
Nope, no other questions.
Awesome.
Not in the Q&A anyway.
Okay, so when I was at Genesee Community College, we did get an OCR complaint and needed to make significant changes to our websites. Our previous systems librarian was awesome and had started our web pages really, early on in the late 90s. So we had tons and tons of pages. We had pages that were both on the college website, and then we also had LibGuides. So there were a lot of pages to look at. Hundreds of pages, and also a lot of things to clean up, not because people necessarily did things wrong, but because the way pages are styled, the way that you format things, the way that you set up layout really has changed in order to be easier to use with screen readers and those kinds of things. So I know that when I was first working on this stuff, I would look at these recommendations and they meant nothing to me. I was totally confused. I had to work really closely with our campus webmaster to understand what this even meant. So I thought I'd take some time and go through some of the web accessibility recommendations and kind of translate them into plain English, because I know it was challenging for me to figure them out at first. So let's get started here. Okay, so what I'm showing in the left-hand column, these are from the EIT Web Accessibility Guidelines. And again, this is separate from the library guidelines. This is specifically about web, and this is for everybody in SUNY, not just libraries. This is for, campus webmasters, anybody who maintains a website in SUNY. So here's a direct link to where this is found. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of their recommendations and I'm going to try and translate it for you a little bit. This is not going to be completely exhaustive, but I picked out things that I thought were kind of confusing and thought we would talk about it a little bit. So first, we're talking about the structure of the web page. So this is how is your page laid out. I know that when I was first starting to do web design, it was super handy to use headings to make fonts and make text look fancy or pretty or whatever. So that is not recommended. And if you're going to use headings at all, you want to make sure that the structure is logical. So you don't want to, if you want something on your page to be big and dark blue, style it that way on purpose. Don't use a heading to make it that way, because if you start throwing headings around just for styling, that can throw off a screen reader because they will read in the order of the headings. So if you have an H1 and then you go to an H3, that can really confuse the screen reader. You should only have one H1 on the page. And that's the, the heading code. That means that's the most important thing on the page. And that should be your title of the page. And a lot of times, like LibGuides, you aren't even allowed to use an H1 because they reserve that for the title of the page, and all that coding happens behind the scenes. So what you want to do is design your page so that the order of the information would make sense when it was read by a screen reader. So that's this reading order is logical and intuitive. And you also want to make sure that information and relationships that were implied by visual or auditory formatting are conveyed in accessible ways. And what that means is don't use color or audio alone to define meaning. So if you have a section that's really important and you made the font red, you're going to have to identify that section as being important textually or some other way, because somebody who's colorblind or someone who has low vision might not be able to tell just from the color alone that that's an important part of your page. Okay. So this was something that I kind of had a hard time with when I was first trying to fix our pages. So one of the important things for keyboard navigation is provide a method to skip repetitive navigation. So what they mean is, if somebody's using a screen reader, every time they go to a new page, they don't want to have to listen to, okay, here's your breadcrumbs, and here's your navigation, and here's these tabs, and here's that. They just want to go to the main content. So you have to create this skip to main content link. And if you have pages on your college website, you're going to have to figure out how to do that yourself or work with your webmaster to make that happen. One of the great things about LibGuides is that they do this for you. And so again, you want to make that the first option when you're tabbing. And you can test that if you go to a web page and just hit tab, something like this should pop up. You should be able to see a skip to main content link that would take you right to the body of the page. So what does that mean? When I said that LibGuides does this for you, so here's the information, go to your website, hit the tab key, you should get a skip link option right away. If you're in LibGuides, if you go to the admin system settings, look and feel, and then page layout, you can see down in the template code, they already have this for you. And you would be able to see that if you were testing your LibGuides as well. But one of the great things about using LibGuides is that I have found them really responsive to questions about accessibility. They'll explain why they did things certain ways if you're getting an error, but they also have done a lot of proactive work to make their pages accessible and also responsive. So, if you're using LibGuides, that's great. You're off to a good start in terms of making your pages accessible. Any questions so far? Let me look back in the, okay. So another section is keyboard navigation, and you want to make sure that all of your links are available using the keyboard. And you can test that by doing that tab. So you open your web page, you hit tab, you should see the skip link first thing, and then you should be able to tab through the whole page and go to every link. So when they say there are no keyboard traps, what that means is something like if your page has a Twitter feed where you have to you click on it to activate it, but then you have to click out of it to get somewhere else on the page. That's not good for accessibility, because you can, the screen reader would get stuck in that area and wouldn't have a way to get out of it. If you are using tab index, which is something that you use with tabbed boxes, you want to make sure that the tabbing order, you want to make sure that you don't have any numbers in there. I'm going to be a little vague about this because I don't have a lot of really specific information about it, but I'm thinking about, we used to have a tabbed box for our Olive search. So we had a, search the catalog, and then there was another tab that was like search articles, search reserve. I can't remember what it was. It's been a year and it's all a blur now. But in that tabbed box, there were these numbers, and that can throw off a screen reader. So just be careful if you're trying to use these little numbers to show like which tab should come first. It can be a problem. So you want to make sure that the order that the person tabs through the page is logical and makes sense and flows well. And if you have some high numbers in those tab index, that can make it go to those spaces first rather than logically going through the page. This keyboard focus, what that means is once you hit a link, you should get a box around it, and that'll show that that's what you're linking on, and it helps people with low vision identify where they are on the page. It's really handy. You can kind of see the example if we go back to see how there's well, I outlined this in red, but there is kind of an outline around this. So it just tells you where you are on the page. So that's what you want to do with your keyboard focus, and that's something that's controlled with CSS. Again, if you're using LibGuides and using their default CSS, that's already done for you. And this presentation layout and navigation, make sure it's consistent. What that means is if you have different pages in the same site, don't change your navigation. Don't change your tab order, don't change things, because it can really throw somebody off if they're going through the site and they think they have a handle on how to navigate, and then you change things up to make the pages different or exciting. That can be a problem. So now we're going to talk a little bit about color. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure that color is not the only means used to convey information. So if you have a pie chart that has colors to identify different areas but no text identifiers, that's not great, because if you are colorblind, you might not be able to see the difference in the different slices of the pie. This is a huge thing, and this is something you can test with a wave tool, or there's a bunch of different ways you can test your contrast. And what that means is, something like this. So you have a dark blue background and white text. You want to make sure that that has the right contrast ratio so that it can be easily seen by people who have low vision or are colorblind, etc. So there are tons of color checking tools, and I do have a page in that accessibility guide that gives you some ideas for how to do that. What's great is so many of these accessibility checkers are free, or they're add-ons that you can add to your browser. So it really makes it easy for you to try and remediate any issues that you may find in your websites. And then this is back to the, if you do have to use color to convey information, you want to make sure that there's enough contrast so that it's easy to use. And this was a good tip from a recent DQ class that I took, that you can, if you go to your taskbar in Windows, you can choose high contrast settings and play around with those, and you can see some people do use those settings to make it easier to see. Some people have a hard time with white backgrounds, and so maybe they change the settings for the contrast. So you can play around with that and see what a person with vision issues might be seeing if they made changes to that kind of thing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about links. This is something that is interesting and was not always the way that the web pages were designed. So what the recommendation is now is you want the link text to describe the destination of the link. So, 15 years ago when you were designing a web page, you would write something out and then you'd say, for more information, click here, and the click here would be the link to the thing. And now what the recommendation is to actually put the link on the language. So, if I wanted to point you to information about something, it's better to put the link on the something rather than saying click here. Because if you have a bunch of links in a page that all say click here, but they go to different destinations, that can be really confusing if you're using a screen reader. And this is something that sparks a lot of errors in LibGuides. We are trying to clean up our own LibGuides. So if you have something, if you create an asset in LibGuides and you want to put more information about it, it comes up with this more ... And then if you have several of these on a page, you're going to get several links called more, and that can be really confusing. It doesn't give somebody who's using a screen reader any information about where that link is going to. So that's this, all links should be distinguishable. You should be able to, if you're using a screen reader, tell where each link is going, and you should be able to determine the difference between links. One of the challenges to this that we were talking about in the SLSS is, what if you have documentation, our training guides that people want to print out, and they need to see the actual code of the link because they may just have to type it in from a sheet of paper. So, in that case, you might want to write out the whole link, or, I have links in here that are, spelled out. So just something to keep in mind. Try to avoid that, but if you are going to need to be able to see that link address and not just click on something, you may have to have some exceptions to following these rules. Another thing that we do all the time, because it seems like a good idea so you don't lose where you are, is making links open in a new page. And that's not great for accessibility if you aren't telling people that the link's going to open in a new page, because if you're going through with a screen reader and you hit this link and all of a sudden you're in this whole new place, it's confusing. So the recommendation is to make links open in the same page, so that then you wouldn't have to go and close the page that's sitting on top of the other one. But you're gonna have to decide for your own design what works best for you. Okay, I am running through this super fast, so let me just make sure there's no more questions. Okay. So another thing I wanted to talk about, that there are recommendations for our images. Most people are aware of this. The recommendation is to provide alt text. So if you have a picture on your page, you should put a description of what that picture means. Again, from the DQ training, there's a really good section on images and how to name them. One of the things they recommend is to not say screenshot of blah, blah, blah. And I do that all the time. So I have to actually go back and fix a bunch of things to remove that kind of language. You don't need to say, you know, picture of tree, picture of whatever, screenshot of how to do something in Alma, because it's just assumed that this is an image and the screen reader knows it's an image, so you don't need to include that kind of language. You want to say why the image is in there. You know, if you have a picture of a tree because you're trying to symbolize growth or something, don't just say tree. Explain why your picture is in your document. But you also want to do that in less than 150 characters. So it can be a little challenging to get a really good alt tag. If it's a decorative image and you're just trying to make your page pretty, what you are recommended to do is just put a double quote in there, because that is how the screen reader identifies that it's a decorative image. If you have an image that's used as a link and it's within an href and it's already got a name for the link, you do not have to have alt text for the link target. I think that's what that means. Yes, so if the same visualization is made by using text alone, an image not used, yes. So you want to have both the image and the text if possible. Okay, this is what I was mentioning about so you have a URL and a text link, and you can just use a null alt tag because it already has, within the A tags, it already has the name of the link where you're going to. So don't use an image alone to convey meaning. That kind of makes sense. That's along with color. You know, if somebody can't see your image, they won't know what it's about. So you do want to explain what the image is doing there and what people need to know about it. The other thing is, as long as you're in there editing your images and adding alt tags, make sure to assign width as a percentage to help with responsive design. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. But the point of that is you're already in there, you're making changes. You might as well try and fix some of your responsive design issues. And what I mean by that is you want images in your websites to, if somebody's using a phone to look at it, you want the images to shrink down. You don't want, if you hard code the image as 500 pixels, it's not going to smush down when you're looking at it on a phone. But if you design it to be, I don't know, 75% of the page, it's going to be 75% of the page no matter the size of the screen that somebody's looking at. So it's really good practice to do images or anything else. Try not to hard code as much as possible in terms of size, because people use all different size devices to look at your content. So I mentioned for the how to manage the images themselves, this is in LibGuides. So, if you need to go back and change and add alt tags, all you do is edit your text area, your rich text format area. You right click on the image and there's this image properties option that comes up. And then once you get in there, here's where you can put your alternative text. And then I was saying about the width, it's better to make it percentage than hard coded. So you can just put the percentage right in here. I usually leave the height blank because I don't want to tie it to any particular height. The width is usually enough to make it the size that I want, because that will flex with the size of the screen. In SortSite, we do get an error that says that if you don't put a height in, it can be bad for screen readers because I don't know why exactly, but I'm going to stick with just the width for now until I learn more about that and how that works. All right, let me just check in. Okay, see there's a question. When using the alt equals double quotes, is there supposed to be a space? I don't think so. I copied all of this stuff on the left directly from the web accessibility, and I don't think there's a space in there, but I could certainly be incorrect about that. So if somebody knows that, feel free to answer in the chat. But I think I would do it exactly as what it said here in the presentation, because I did take that right from the web accessibility standards. But good question. So let's talk a little bit about multimedia. I'm going to check my time. Okay. What you want to do for multimedia is, if somebody needs captions for something, you want to both give them the option to ask for captions and then also make sure that the captions get done in a timely manner. So you want to, you know, one of the things that the library accessibility guidelines recommend is to have some kind of a footer or something in your site that tells people who to contact if they have any requests for accessible content. So this is just saying that, you know, if somebody asks for captions, make sure you can get that done in a timely way. For anything that's public facing for AV content, again, like if you have a YouTube how to use the library thing, make sure that there's synchronized captions for that. What's great about something like YouTube is that it'll caption it for you. You probably will have to correct a lot of the auto captioning, but it gives you a good place to start with that. Same thing for audio only. You want to make sure that you provide a transcript so that somebody could read if they have hearing accessibility concerns, they'd be able to read what was said in the session. And descriptive audio for audio and video only when needed. You want to allow people to request that. Live captioning is an option, but I think descriptive audio is if you have somebody, I think that's when it tells you what's going on in the scene if you're not able to see it. So it's not just the dialogue, it's also what else is happening. This one about audio and video begin playing on page load. What that means is don't have it auto start because that can throw somebody off if they're using a screen reader. You want to let them decide when to start the audio or video. And then synchronized captions for live audio video content. That's really a best practice recommendation. This one about frames and iframes, you want to make sure that they have appropriate titles. If you're copying a video from Vimeo or YouTube or something like that, the title doesn't come with that as a default. So you do want to just add this code in the iframe code. It's title equals quotes. This is, you know, whatever your title is. Okay. Let me see here. All right, we're almost done. So labels, tables, or titles, you want to make sure that all of your form controls are properly labeled. I know that that's an issue. Some of the original default code that we had for our Primo search codes wasn't labeled correctly, so that is something that we went back and edited in our FAQ about how to make a widget for your Primo searching. So you just want to make sure that the form controls are labeled correctly and also that your tables are properly labeled. So I know that in the past, it was really one of the few ways to set up your web pages was to set up a table and you would use it for display rather than for data, but that's really frowned upon now. You really want to use divs to line things up on your page rather than setting it up as like with a table in the background that's invisible, because it makes it hard for screen readers to read in the correct order. So you really want to only use tables when absolutely necessary, and you want to use them for data. So you also want to identify what the header cells are, and you use this TH code for that, and you can see here. So here's my first row of the table. TR is table row, and then so row action menu and functionality, these are the header rows, and you want to identify those with the THs. So you have a begin TH and an end TH, and then from that on you just use the normal TD. If you have no idea what I'm talking about here, what you would do is open, again, if you're in LibGuides, you open your rich text format box. There's this source tag. This is super helpful. If you toggle this on and off, you can see actually what's going on behind the scenes, and this is where you can make those kinds of changes. And I would say do as I say, not as I do, because I have had many problems with this. If you forget an end caret or something like that, it can totally throw it off. So just be, you can make changes in here, and I encourage you to look at this, but just be super careful. It really cares deeply about where your punctuation is, and if you miss something, you could have an exciting mess to clean up. But it's really great that you're able to see the background code in LibGuides for this. Again, try to avoid nested complex tables that would be hard for a screen reader to follow. So, if you have complex information, you may have to do that, but try to keep things as clear and simple as you can on your pages. Okay, a couple of miscellaneous things to talk about. You want to make sure that every page contains a link to an accessibility statement. That was that thing I was saying about you want to have some kind of a footer that says who to contact if you need captions or need help, or if you're finding you're unable to get to something on the page because of accessibility issues. So you do want to do that. You want to make sure that the page works when the text size is doubled, because many people, if they have low vision, they may enlarge the page. So you might want to just play around with that. Try making the text size, the page view bigger, and see if it still makes sense, if things still flow correctly, those kinds of things. You want to make sure that the title of the page makes sense. You don't want to just be, so-and-so library with no other information. You want to distinguish this page from another page. You want to identify the language of the page, and that will certainly be flagged by some kind of an accessibility checker if you don't have the language in there, because screen readers do need to know what language you are using on your page. This is the same as I said, don't use images or color to convey information. So you just want to make sure that if you have any instructions, make sure that they're textual and that they can be read. This was really big when people figured out they could make stuff flash on their page back in the mid 2000s. Everybody went crazy making things flash. That is not awesome, particularly for people who have epilepsy or vision issues. So the less flashing, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But if you have a rule that you need to follow, make sure that it doesn't flash more than 3 times per second. And then, whoops, I was just going to say that if there is timing, if your page is going to time out, make sure that you give your user the option to turn off the timing or extend it, because some people might need longer to process the information than others. So you don't want to have something that's, click here now in 5 seconds and then it goes away. You want to make sure that you give people enough time. This one, multiple ways are available to find other web pages on the site. I'm not completely sure what they meant by this particular rule, but I think it's that, you want to have breadcrumbs and you want to have some kind of a menu that shows people how to move around on the site. So don't just use one way to help people navigate. And then if you do have a section on your page that is in a different language, you want to use a language tab to let the screen reader know that this is a different language, because it will use different pronunciation rules for that particular language. And if you don't identify it when the content's being read out loud, it's not going to make sense. Okay, and then my final tip, and I see this all the time, and I am also guilty of this. When you're making a LibGuide and you're trying to get some information in there and nobody has enough time to do all the things that they want to do, a lot of times you will just copy stuff off of a web page and then plunk it in there. And the problem is when you do that, if you don't put it in Notepad first or some other thing that would strip out the extra styling, you get all this weird style. And that can make your pages inconsistent. It can introduce styling that you don't really want. So here's the thing I copied from email. It added, this color stuff. It made the font family this family. And this may not be what my default font family is in our LibGuides site. We may have something else set up. So just be aware that when you're pasting stuff, you may be unintentionally getting a lot of information that you don't need as far as styling the content. And you can see this if you click on that source toggle on off in LibGuides. You can see all this behind the scenes stuff. So one way to get around this is to paste it into Notepad. But the problem with that is then you lose linking, you lose any kind of special coding that you might need on the page. So I just wanted you to be aware that this kind of thing happens and you might need to check on it. I'm going to just take a moment. Okay. All right, and that is, I am done with my presentation and I'm open if you have any questions. I'm going to just take a look at the chat.
Michelle Brendan says the multiple way to access web pages guideline may be for better search engine optimization. I believe that is true, but I think you're also correct that it has to do with breadcrumbs, so that there's more than one way to find anything you need. It's related to the universal design principle of multiple means of access. So if you make a mistake, your design should try to be forgiving so that there are different ways that people can find things without necessarily having to know specialized jargon or know particular ways of finding things.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And thanks, Maggie, for looking into the space between the quotes. I appreciate that. So I'm just taking a look at the Q&A. So it looks like there is a question in the Q&A about using, they're setting up a controlled digital lending service, and one of the things they need to do for that is they have to make sure they use digital rights management, DRM, to prevent copying and redistribution. And now they need to OCR the PDF. It'll wipe out the DRM. That is a great question, and I really don't know. So let me, yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't have a good answer for that. But that might be, there are contact people for the SUNY EIT, and this might be a really good question for the, I'm trying to think of what group. There's a digital objects group, so that might be a good question for them. Let me go see what they're called. Hang on. Yeah, digital content. I think that would be a good question for them. Any other questions or discussion points? This is a huge area. Leah from Geneseo is asking, she's part of the library accessibility guidelines team at Milne, and your campus has a license for SiteImprove. Do you see any advantages to SortSite over SiteImprove? No, I don't. SiteImprove does the same kind of thing. We chose to use SortSite for SLSS because it was cheaper than SiteImprove, honestly, and actually it was recommended by Grace Valente, who's at SUNY Central, and it seemed to be, you know, a quicker, lower cost product to use. But SiteImprove is great. That's what we used at Genesee, and I think it's a really good thing to use. So that's a great question, but I think you're good with SiteImprove. Anything else anybody wants to talk about? So Peter has a question about how we can deal with a database provider that doesn't meet New York standards. Do you mean the EIT standards that are required here? One of the things, yeah, okay. So as I mentioned, we're starting this third-party vendor VPAT repository. We are completely aware that the VPAT is not the whole story, and that the VPATs are often provided by the vendor, and they're not always completely accurate about what kinds of accessibility that vendor is providing. So there's a small accessibility cohort that's starting, and our goal with that is to review the VPATs and see if they're accurate. So we're going to look at that, and my expectation is that if we find discrepancies, we're not planning to do huge site reviews of the actual vendor site, but in the VPAT, if we find things that don't seem to make sense or don't seem to be right, our plan is to contact the vendors and have them address that. At this point in time, we don't have plans to do big vendor reviews unless we get funding to do that. If we did, I know that we would be reporting that information to the vendors. The Big Ten has been doing reviews of sites. They've had actually, it was DeQ and a group at Michigan State, I think. And I know that they are providing feedback to the vendors. So I would encourage you to go look at the Big Ten accessibility repository, because there might be information in there about what they have already reported to the vendors. So I don't think there's any hard and fast thing about, well, you know, we can't use this if they don't meet the standards, but it is certainly something that everybody is concerned about and looking at.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. This was really interesting.
Great. I hope it was helpful. I'm sorry I talked at you all for quite a bit. There's just a lot to cover. So I hope that you find it useful.